Hello everyone, Sam here, and today we are going to talk about Rider Haggard. Not H. Rider Haggard, the author, but Rider Haggard, the book. This was a book written by Norman Etherington and published in 1984, and it is about H. Rider Haggard. Specifically, this was the first attempted book length academic study of H. Rider Haggard, who, at the time, Etherington thought needed closer study than what a lot of academia had given Haggard at the time. I chose this book for my nonfiction choice for Haggard January because I am actually very interested in how academics perceive fantasy and adventure authors. Uh, Sometimes they get them, sometimes they don't, but it's very interesting to see people's thoughts on it, especially with academia when uh, academia is generally more focused on like traditional literary fiction and not so much the fantastical genres that are generally seen as more escapist or, you know, not to be crude, but lowest common denominator stuff. I do not find it lowest common denominator stuff, but that tends to be the perception in a lot of academic circles. So, but who is Norman Etherington? Based on my research, Etherington is an American professor, though apparently he currently teaches in Australia. Uh, and his general focus has been studying South African and European imperialism. And someone who is focused on imperialism probably would have an interest in H. Rider Haggard, given how he's heavily associated with imperialist ideas. But Etherington didn't just do this book about Haggard. He's actually done several books that are either directly focused on Haggard's works or sort of at least adjacent to H. Rider Haggard. Uh, this includes academic books like The Annotated She, which is a long form study of Haggard's adventure novel She. He also did one called The Great Treks, The Transformation of South Africa, 1815 to 1854. And this apparently deals with the migration of the Zulus and the Boers of South Africa, which are very heavy focuses in Haggard's fiction, particularly because Haggard was familiar with South Africa. And he also did a story called Big Game Hunter, a biography of Frederick Courtney Salis. And Salis is very important because he was actually considered the main inspiration for Alan Quatermain, H. Rider Haggard's big game hunting character from King Solomon's Mines and later Alan Quatermain. And he actually became Haggard's most popular and well-known character, who was in a lot of other stories that Haggard wrote later on. And Salis was also a big game hunter who was also an adventurer, so a lot of people have seen the parallels between him and Quatermain. So Etherington has quite obviously an apparent interest in Haggard and a lot of things Haggard was interested in. So in a lot of ways he might be the best person to write this study, given how close his interests seem to intertwine with Haggard. And in this study, he splits Haggard's works into three categories. The social novels, which were basically the sort of traditional literary kind of novels that are focused on modern problems and don't really have any fantastical elements or at least overtly ones. You know, the traditional Victorian novel of the era. You might call them realistic or social novels. The second category is his Lost World stories, stories where characters go to far off lands and find strange new worlds. As I mentioned in another video, Haggard didn't invent the Lost World genre, but he definitely popularized it. And it was his works that really codified the genre. And the third category is historical romances. And these were ones where Haggard did historical stories that were set in the past, sometimes not terribly far in the past, but sometimes centuries into the past. It was a sort of an interesting trend that came about after he'd done a fair number of Lost World stories. So Etherington separates them from the Lost World on the basis of time. Essentially, if the stories were taking place in Haggard's time, they tended to be Lost World stories or social novels. If they were in the past, they were generally historical romances. So that's sort of an interesting element that he talks about with Haggard's work. Now, this story is an academic work, so it's not done like a traditional fiction or nonfiction story where there's kind of a plot or characters that you can examine like as a fictional or non-fictional work of art. It's very much an academic study talking about Etherington's observations, citing quotes, talking about Haggard's work, or examinations of Haggard's work. So I'm not going to rank or grade this like I would a book with a plot. I'm going to more talk about the things that Etherington, I believe, gets right and does in an interesting way, and stuff that he gets wrong or maybe doesn't quite stick the landing with the point he's trying to make. So this will be talking about the pros and cons of this collection, but it's not going to be gauging it based on plot. It's going to be gauging it more on its observations. So to talk about first the observations that do work, and I do think Etherington does a good job with, he really helps you understand Haggard as a person, particularly when talking about his life story. As I said in my Haggard January video, I didn't really know much about Haggard going into this event, so learning more about him as a person was kind of an interesting experience, and I think Etherington does make a lot of interesting points about Haggard's life story. And there's some really interesting things I learned about Haggard. Some of the ones I wrote down is that he had a young love in his youth that, due to familial circumstances, he was separated from, and he always sort of pined for the rest of his life. He did get married to another woman, and by all accounts had an amicable relationship with her, but this first love was apparently always on his mind for a large part of his life. Haggard was also fixated on reincarnation. Apparently a lot of his stories deal with the idea of reincarnated lovers. I'm reading She right now, and She has a very heavy emphasis on reincarnation. And apparently this happens a lot in his other books. So he kind of was very obsessed with reincarnation as a way of obtaining happiness. You know, if lovers couldn't be together or find their happiness in this life, they might find it in another. So that was kind of a interesting fixation Etherington points out. Etherington also reveals that Haggard traveled very extensively. He went to Iceland, Egypt, Mexico. and lots of other places, and he did that to get inspiration for his books, and basically to get some local color and sort of get the vibe of the place he was setting his stories in. So, which I think was wise because, King Solomon's Mines was written because he spent time in South Africa as a young man. So, yeah, sometimes going to a place to get the feel of it can very much help with your writing. Other fun facts. Etherington actually revealed sort of an interesting thing about how Haggard actually suffered depression when he was in his 30s or 40s because his son, Jock, died from measles, and apparently Haggard was in a bit of a depression for a very long time, and it took him a while to get over that, so that was an element I didn't really know much about. Etherington also points out that Haggard was very popular with the reading audience of the time, but not with the critics. Apparently he was always kind of in a tussle with literary critics who generally did not see the value of his work. And apparently he was always kind of trying to appeal to them, sometimes with his social novels, but apparently it was kind of a losing battle. But I also learned that apparently Haggard was an agricultural reform figurehead. He apparently did this big push to do agricultural reform in Great Britain and even ran for Parliament on that platform. He didn't win, but apparently this land reform he was running on was a big political issue of the day, so it was interesting seeing that element of him. And apparently, this part I didn't know because I didn't know much about silent cinema, but apparently right before Haggard's death in 1925, his works actually had a bit of a resurgence in the 20s due to silent cinema adapting a lot of his works. And because, he had written King Solomon's Mines in 1885, I believe. So it had been over 30 years since some of his earliest books had been written. But then silent cinema started adapting them, and he kind of got back in the zeitgeist. And he was around long enough to see his name start being maybe not revered, but appreciated before his passing in 1925. So a little bit of a silver lining there. Some authors don't really get their flowers while they're alive, but there was at least one artistic medium in silent cinema that gave him his due when he was still around. So that was kind of an interesting thing to learn. In regards to Etherington's writing, I really like this one thesis Etherington has where he makes the argument that Haggard was using his Lost World adventures as kind of a metaphor because they were always adventures into the unknown, and he thought they were meant to be metaphors for journeying into the subconscious. These stories about, these characters who go into unknown lands and discover new things about themselves were basically metaphors for journeying into the subconscious. And Etherington provides a lot of good evidence for this because he points out that one of Haggard's favorite books, and maybe supposedly the one that really inspired him to step into adventure fiction, was Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that, of course, is a story all about the desires of the subconscious coming up to the surface. So Etherington also points out that a lot of Haggard's fiction dealt with how the heroes of the story sort of unleash their savage natures when they go into these ancient lands. Like there's sort of this theme of civilizational regression. These characters sort of go backwards in terms of their like civilizational holding. They go from these dapper gentlemen to these raging warriors. I read King Solomon's Mines, and that's a theme in the story because the one of the characters, Sir Henry, is stated to be sort of Viking descent, and he kind of turns into a Viking berserker during the great final battle of that story. So that's kind of an interesting element that Etherington points out. And probably the strongest evidence he points out is both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the famous psychologists, absolutely loved Haggard's stories and cited them in their psychoanalysis studies, basically saying, oh, these are analogous to our studies in psychoanalysis, going deeper into the mind. So that's a really interesting element that Etherington points out. The sixth chapter of the study does a very good job at discussing the complexities of Haggard's personal politics, because Etherington wanted to point out that as someone who did a lot of imperialism studies, Etherington is kind of approaching Haggard as an object of study and saying, well, was he imperialist or was he anti-imperialist? And he sort of addresses the folks who claim that Haggard is anti-imperialist by basically saying, well, no, he was imperialist, but he wasn't really the traditional image of an imperialist. He wasn't what most people think of when they think of that British Victorian era imperialist. He had kind of a different view of imperialism. He kind of subscribed to this belief of like sort of a hands-off imperialism where the exploitation of the colony was more about financial elements than really like social or religious ones. And it was a very sort of complex view on imperialism. And Etherington points out that makes a very good argument that you can't really declare Haggard a noble anti-imperialist nor a vicious imperialist, because he just sort of had this weird viewpoint on imperialism that neither side can really claim him. He was just sort of his own weird thing, and basically looking at how some of the contradictions of Haggard's beliefs and his fiction sort of worked within his beliefs regarding imperialism. He also does a good job of explaining why Haggard was better at writing these Lost World adventures than the traditional Victorian dramas he sometimes tried to do. And he makes the argument that with the contemporary Victorian social novels, Haggard was frequently more talking about himself and the things in his life rather than focusing on the stories like he did with the adventure novels, where he was much more focused on the actual plot and scenario as well as the characters in the adventure novels, whereas with the Victorian social novels, Etherington argues he was too hung up with his own personal politics and his viewpoints about the world. So there's only one social novel that Etherington recommends, and it's one titled Beatrice. He argues that's the only one that has any substantial quality that Haggard ever really wrote. He argues the rest of them are kind of bunk, but Beatrice, he argues, is actually a decent enough one. Etherington also does a good job highlighting how Haggard uses women in his fiction. And he says that while Haggard wasn't really a feminist, he did have a more nuanced view on women than he's given credit for, and he did a lot of different kinds of female characters in his stories. And he deserves, and Etherington argues that he deserves a lot of credit for making interesting women despite the restrictions of Victorian era sensibilities. And he also makes an interesting point about how Haggard had this very deep obsession with escape, like the theme of escaping the modern world, because apparently that permeates a lot of Haggard's fiction. And you escape, and with Haggard you escaped one of two ways. You either went to a lost world, or you went to the past, and that's why he had Lost Worlds and historical romances, because those were basically the ways Haggard saw as escaping the modern world. And he actually, in fact, Etherington has this one point where he points out that Haggard started doing historical romances about the time Africa had been fairly well mapped, and there wasn't really much of a chance of finding Kukana land or the Valley of Kor like he had in his early books. So he kind of went to historical romances as a way to talk about, or not talk about, just to get away from the modern world. So that was kind of an interesting element. The last few things that Etherington does a good job with is that he gives a lot of examples of writers who were influenced by Haggard, and it's not just ones later on that you would expect him to mention, but he mentions a lot of contemporary writers who were actually very much inspired by him. And this one, I was surprised by this one, but actually Rudyard Kipling was heavily influenced by Haggard's works, and Kipling was even friends with Haggard. He and Haggard apparently swapped story ideas every now and then, and wrote the others' story ideas in their own books. And he points out that Kipling's story, The Man Who Would Be King, is actually very similar to King Solomon's Mines, and how Kipling might have taken some influence from King Solomon's Mines when writing The Man Who Would Be King. Then there's also another contemporary, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who, of course, wrote The Lost World. So that is a pretty obvious influence. And also John Buchan. I mentioned John Buchan. I thought maybe the influence was minimal, but Etherington argues that John Buchan actually was quite influenced by Haggard, because John Buchan wrote a number of Lost World stories like No Man's Land and The Grove of Ashtaroth. And I didn't notice this, but I was reading The 39 Steps not too long ago, John Buchan's famous thriller story, and Buchan actually name drops Haggard in The 39 Steps. Somebody was talking about the situation the main character is in, and he mentions, oh, it's just like Haggard stories or something like that. So so Buchan was apparently very influenced by Haggard, and that's just really interesting to me. And Etherington also does a good job showing the influence on Haggard's influence on later authors of fantasy. You've got the obvious one, Edgar Rice Burroughs, because if you saw my Haggard January video, you know like a quarter of Edgar Rice Burroughs' stuff has some sort of tie to Haggard's ideas of Lost Worlds. Like that's almost like a quarter, maybe even a third of Edgar Rice Burroughs' output of Lost Worlds. But then he also gave some other examples that I didn't really realize, but the more I thought about it, I went, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like Edgar Wallace. He had this character called Sanders of the River, who apparently had some sort of African adventures, and as well as King Kong, because Edgar Wallace helped write the script for King Kong, which again, half of that story is pretty much a Lost World story, because the characters go from New York to this lost island, and of course they discover Kong. So, yeah, there's definitely some influence there. And two others I was kind of surprised by were C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. C.S. Lewis, he doesn't give a firm example regarding Lewis, but I know he was probably inferring the Chronicles of Narnia, given how that frequently involves a sort of lost world type. Obviously, it's not quite the same because it's a magical realm, but there's very much an idea of Narnia as this far off place that exists, and we can get to it by Earth, but we can't always figure out how to get to it. So, and with Tolkien, he makes a much better argument because he points out that a lot of the things in King Solomon's mines was some stuff that Tolkien would do in Lord of the Rings, like making detailed maps of where the land is, doing these discussions about the past of these lands, and just generally these ideas that Tolkien would sort of take up and do in a much more in-depth manner, but something he did get from Haggard. So that was very interesting, seeing all these people who had written fantasy and how Haggard had influenced them. Ooh, just a quick sip. So now I want to talk about the things that Etherington brings up or discusses that I don't think he does either adequately, or I think he's just wrong when he talks about them. And as I said before, this is an academic study, and despite the fact that academic studies, you're supposed to be, pretty even-handed and temper your criticisms, or at least not try to make them too blatant. Etherington makes it very clear he has a couple of biases towards Haggard that he can't really hide, and it really reflects in the writing. Excuse me. Well, the first big thing is that Etherington kind of makes this assertion that, Haggard failed as a writer because he didn't really succeed with the social novels he was initially trying to write, and he had to work in the accursed historical romance and Lost World stories for the rest of his career, and he was always struggling to get out of that slave mine of the slave mine of genre and be a serious author. And I've read some other things that say, well, that's not entirely the case. He might have like initially wanted to be a social novelist, but maybe he got more comfortable with Lost Worlds and fantasy. So that kind of feels like Etherington thinking in the sense of, all true writers want to be these social novelists. So if you don't work at that, you're obviously a failure. And it's like, that's not entirely a true sentiment. He also is very critical of this essay that Haggard wrote called On Fiction. And it was Haggard trying to defend fantasy and adventure stories as legitimate literature that could be enjoyed and has artistic value just as much as the social novels. And Etherington poses it as if, oh, this essay was a complete failure. Like it made him a laughing stock, and Haggard was never accepted by the literati ever again, and he was forever burned by that. Which, again, I've heard some conflicting things. Some people say, yeah, the literati didn't like it, but apparently it's still a very influential essay today. DMR Books had a whole article about it, about how it was an influential essay defending fantasy fiction. So obviously a lot of people like it. And yeah, I'm not sure how true that is, whether it was just a huge failure of an essay or not. So Etherington sees it as it because it didn't it doesn't seem to comply with Etherington's taste. So again, maybe he's right, but I've seen some evidence suggest that wasn't entirely true. But oh yeah, this was a big one. Etherington does this thing towards the end of the chapter focused on Haggard's female characters, where he makes the argument that H. Rider Haggard had an incestuous fixation with his mother, and his evidence for this is the character of Ayesha and She, as well as two other points of evidence that are extremely flimsy, I would say. He basically has these two pieces of evidence are, one, Haggard had a doll that he played with as a boy, who he called She Who Must Be Obeyed, which is Ayesha's title in She. And the second is that Haggard was so distraught over his mother's passing that even 20 years after she died, he didn't really want to talk about her passing. And I don't think I have to explain to you why that's a pretty flimsy argument that Haggard had an incestuous fixation, because even in She, I haven't finished She, but one, She is not really meant to be a mother of the character Leo Vinci, because he's meant to be the descendant of her lost lover, but again, that's not really framed in an incestuous manner. And plus, claiming that somebody had an incestuous fixation because they felt bad about their parent dying for several years, that's just flimsy as hell. Like that is not a strong argument. Feeling bad for a parent dying, even for a long time, that's not a symbol of a strange fixation. That's just because you like that parent. You know, it's flimsy, and I get what Etherington is doing as someone who has done a little academic writing myself. I get what he's doing, because sometimes you have an idea, you have this thesis, you have this idea, you're like, oh, I know the author or the work that I'm examining is doing this, and I just know it's the case, but you just don't have that much evidence for it, and you start saying, oh, well, you just start really reaching. You reach, and you're like, oh, I've got the evidence here, and you pick the real flimsy evidence, and you pick that, and you try to expand your idea from that. And that feels like what Etherington's doing here. He says, oh, he felt bad about his mother for several years. That means there was an incestuous fixation, which is, yeah, I don't think I have to explain why that's not a firm belief. So that insinuation is pretty far-fetched, in my opinion. And then you have times where Etherington brings up these really interesting ideas and then just doesn't follow up on them. He just kind of mentions them in passing and then moves on. when he really should be examining these ideas more clearly. Because at one point he makes this interesting assertion that King Solomon's Mines is secretly anti-imperial, despite presenting as an imperial story, and that Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness is secretly pro-imperial, despite having anti-imperial presentation. And that's a pretty interesting thing, because Heart of Darkness, as a lot of folks know, was sort of framed as this like discussion about the cost of imperialism. So seeing Etherington say, "Oh, actually, this story was kind of making an argument for imperialism," that's an interesting insinuation. But the second he makes it, he then drops it, and he brings it up once later on. But again, it's not really discussed in depth. It's kind of just passingly mentioned, and I'm like, well, why'd you make that assertion if you weren't going to discuss it? Like, that feels like something that you could do a whole other essay on, just talking about how something that is seemingly seemingly for the pro position is actually anti, and how something that's seemingly anti is actually pro for a certain position. That's a really interesting idea. But Etherington just doesn't follow that up, so it's kind of a weird. Well, wait, why'd you make that big of a claim and then just move on? Like, that feels like something you should follow up on. This is the big one. A lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs fans won't be happy with this, but Etherington is very dismissive of Edgar Rice Burroughs as a writer. He spends a whole long paragraph just saying, yeah, Edgar Rice Burroughs was heavily inspired by H. Rider Haggard. He's very important to keeping Haggard's ideas and themes alive, but he stinks and I don't like him. That's pretty much the paragraph. He goes on and on about, yes, Burroughs, he's very reluctantly saying Burroughs is important to keeping Haggard's ideas alive, but also taking every chance to just say, oh, I don't like this guy. There were two lines in particular I wanted to quote because I think they spell out Etherington's bias as well as being not very accurate to Burroughs' work. The first quote is, quote, certain characteristics of Tarzan reflect Burroughs' peculiarly American brand of anti-intellectualism, particularly the reiterated insistence that brute force and muscle are superior to brains and education, end quote. I have just started Tarzan. I'm still in the middle of the first book, and I'm going to be getting on to the second here soon. But the vibe I'm getting from the story so far is that Tarzan is not just a huge hulking brute. And everything that I've read from other Edgar Rice Burroughs fans says, yeah, he's actually a very intelligent man. He's kind of meant to be the Superman. He's incredibly strong, incredibly deadly, but he's also incredibly intelligent. Apparently he can read several different languages. He's able to get a seat in Parliament or something. So he's a deeply intelligent man. So this idea that, oh yeah, Edgar Rice Burroughs just said, oh, the muscleman, he's a muscleman with Burroughs is anti-intellectual. It's like, well, that's not, if that's true, that's not exactly reflected through Tarzan. It kind of feels like Etherington's thinking more about like the Tarzan movies, you know, kind of the Johnny Weissmuller thing where his intelligence wasn't really emphasized, and he was generally much more of a hulking strongman. So that does not, from everything I know, that does not seem to jive with how Burroughs wrote Tarzan. He also has this other line I want to quote. Quote, Unquestionably, Burroughs was a hack writer of extremely limited talent. End quote. This is another thing, again, as an academic writer, I know this trick. This is a trick where you act like something is undeniably true, because Etherington says unquestionably Burroughs was a hack writer. And it's like, well, that's not really something you can definitively prove. Like that is obviously an opinion. And but you frame it in such a way as that, oh, it is definitely this way. It's all agreed upon. It's like, is it? What was Edgar Rice Burroughs considered a hack writer? Or not even considered, was he a hack writer? And it's like, that's not really something that you can definitively prove. That's pretty obviously an opinion, but you know, it's kind of just his way of saying, "Oh, Burroughs isn't good. I'm saying that, and we're moving on." And it's like, okay, so not a very charitable discussion about Burroughs. So that's a little bit of a weakness in Etherington's POV. Uh, he also does something that kind of annoyed me, where Etherington provided a lot of examples of fantasy writers who were inspired by Haggard, but he doesn't do a lot with the science fiction writers. He gives them their own section, but he only mentions one science fiction author, and it's Edgar Rice Burroughs again. He just quotes the John Carter series, the Barsoom series. This is strange because, one, he already previously mentioned C.S. Lewis, and it's kind of like, why not mention the Space Trilogy there? Like, that was a big part of Lewis's writings, so it's kind of like, well, why not bring that up? And the second thing being, a lot of the examples he gives, he doesn't even go to a science fiction book listing. He just takes an art book of, like, science fiction, and he just lists off the pictures of the art book, saying, oh, this thing kind of looks like something Haggard would have in his stories. And he gives a lot of examples of it, but again, it's just an art book. He's he's describing pictures and saying how it relates to Haggard's work, and it's like, that seems like a waste. It's like, there were plenty of science fiction authors who were inspired by Haggard. Some of them were kind of by proxy, like Ray Bradbury was a big Edgar Rice Burroughs fan, and you can connect that to Haggard, but I'm like, was there really no other science fiction author you might have been able to tie Haggard to? It's like, the 1980s was not a deserted time for science fiction. There were plenty of clubs and discussions about science fiction, so you would think that more examples of science fiction writers influenced by Haggard might pop up, but Etherington doesn't list really that many, so that part was kind of weird to me. He also gives the, like, 2 or 3 paragraphs of what he calls blood and thunder thriller writers, and he basically casts these guys off as like, oh, they're just pro-imperialists and I don't like them. And it's like, well, I feel like I was like, well, can you expand upon why you don't like them? Because it kind of seems like you're dismissing their work out of hand, and you know, it's a bit weird that you make a whole academic study to explain why Haggard's work shouldn't be dismissed out of hand, and then you dismiss these guys' works out of hand. So that feels a little hypocritical in my mind. So I wasn't initially going to give a ranking, but the more I thought about it, the more I went, no, I should give this a ranking. I rank on a 5-star system, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. For Rider Haggard by Norman E. Etherington, I'm going to give it 3 out of 5 stars, which is pleasantly average in my opinion. I I think it is a good first attempt to really dissect Haggard's writing from an academic perspective. Uh, and there are a lot of times where it gives very good points and does a good job explaining how Etherington came to that perspective. Uh, but it's not a 4 or 5 star because there are a fair number of times where Etherington's perspective kind of, instead of enlightening us about Haggard, just kind of gets in the way. Like he has these biases and perspectives that sort of get in the way of looking at Haggard's work, and they kind of just, ironically, much like how Etherington accuses Haggard of being too blinded by his personal biases when he's writing the social novels, there are times here where Etherington kind of gets blinded by his own perspective and biases, to where I don't think he necessarily examines some of Haggard's elements of his life or his work in the best way he could have. And of course, there's also the fact that there's a couple times where Etherington just does not provide a suitable substantiation for some of his points. It's kind of like, it's either opinion masked as, like, it's opinion masked as, no, this is the truth, even though it's blatantly opinion, or it's, he just takes a really flimsy point and tries to make it a bigger deal than it probably is. And those are both problems that can happen in academic writing. So that knocks off a few stars for me. But I do think that this is a good starting point for anybody who's interested in H. Rider Haggard, because it does give a decent overview of his life story and the types of work he did. So if you're a beginner like I am, and just want to sort of look at Haggard's, get sort of an idea of Haggard, then this is a good place to start. You'll probably want to look at other discussions about Haggard and his work, but as a starting point, I think this one is pretty decent. Any inspiration? As a working writer, I sometimes like to discuss whether what I've read has inspired me in any way. And, this has really inspired me to read Edgar Rice Burroughs. That whole paragraph where he's slamming Burroughs, I go, well, okay, now I really want to read him because I want to see why you're so mad about him. So I'm going to be doing a reading event regarding Burroughs here very soon, so I'll definitely be doing that. It's also made me really want to read more of... excuse me. This has also really made me want to read more of Haggard's other works, because right now I've only read King Solomon's Mines. I'm in the middle of She. I'm also reading I'm close to finishing a story of his called Fair Margaret, which was a historical romance. But this story has made me really interested in Haggard's other works, so that's one very good thing about reading this study. In regards to writing inspiration, not much writing inspiration from this because academic writing is not my strong suit. I've done it once, and I found it doesn't really suit me as a writer. I know how to do it. I might be forced to do it sometime in the future, but in regards to actual writing, no. Rider Haggard, the study, does not inspire much in me. All right, well, that's all I have for Rider Haggard, so I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys read some more H. Rider Haggard. And Edgar Rice Burroughs if you have the time to. All right, bye.